The lake had always been my sanctuary. For 40 years I lived on its shore, in a cabin my grandfather built with his bare hands. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. The wooden beams creaked with memories, the fireplace smelled of pine and ash, and the porch looked out over the calmest water you could imagine. At sunrise, the mist rolled across the surface like a blanket, and at night, the stars reflected so clearly that you felt like you were floating between two skies. It was a hidden gem, a place only locals knew about, and we treated it like sacred ground. But then the HOA came. At first it was subtle. Some developers sniffed around, buying little parcels of land here and there. A new family would move in with city plates on their cars. Then came surveyors with clipboards and measuring tapes, muttering about property lines. Before long, a massive sign went up near the old dirt road that led to the lake. Silver Pines Lakeside Development, luxury vacation cabins coming soon. I laughed when I saw it. I thought it was a joke. Who would be foolish enough to try to turn our humble lake into some tourist playground? The lake wasn't built for that kind of traffic, and the land was unpredictable. What they didn't know was that my grandfather and his brothers, back in the 1940s, had built a small but sturdy dam at the far end of the lake to regulate water levels for farming. The dam wasn't visible to outsiders, hidden by the dense pines and rocky outcrops. It wasn't large enough for hydroelectricity or big enough to attract federal attention, but it kept the water level steady for fishing, boating, and irrigation. In short, the dam gave us control of the lake, and control of the lake meant control of everything around it. But the HOA didn't care about history. They cared about profit. The so-called Silver Pines Lakeside HOA popped up overnight, backed by lawyers and investors from the city. They bought up 79 lots around the lake and started construction immediately. Bulldozers roared, trees fell, and dust filled the air. The once quiet forest turned into a construction site, the sound of hammers and generators replacing bird song. They called the cabins vacation retreats, though they looked more like mini mansions, all polished wood, satellite dishes, and neon-lit docks. I tried to fight them the normal way. I attended their HOA meetings. Big mistake. Imagine 50 people in polo shirts sipping lattes while deciding the fate of land they'd never respected. They told me my cabin was an eyesore that lowered property values. They tried to fine me for keeping my fishing nets strung out on my dock. They sent letters demanding I paint my cabin a uniform earth tone to match their luxury rentals. They even complained that my rooster, Old Red, crowed too early and disturbed their vacation guests. Vacation guests. That phrase lit a fire inside me. This wasn't their vacation land. This was my family's lake. But the worst came when they blocked access to locals. They put up gates, posted guards, and declared the roads private. Neighbors I'd known my whole life were suddenly told they couldn't launch their boats unless they paid lake access fees. My childhood friends, families who had fished these waters for generations, were told to buy passes from the HOA to step foot on their own shoreline. That was the day I stopped laughing. I spent the next few months watching. I watched the cabins go up one by one. I watched city folks arrive in shiny SUVs, sipping cocktails on their brand new decks, bragging about their lake. I watched the HOA president, a smug man named Gregory Hart, strut around like he owned the water itself. But they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know about the dam. It was small but powerful. A single gate controlled the outflow, and if opened fully, the lake would drain faster than they could ever imagine. The water level would drop overnight. Docks would be left high and dry, boats stranded in the mud, and their precious vacation paradise would turn into a swampy wasteland. I didn't want to do it at first. I tried to reason with them, to explain that the lake couldn't sustain that much development. They laughed in my face. Gregory smirked and told me, progress is inevitable. You can either join us or get left behind. So I decided to show them just how inevitable nature could be. I began planning. I walked the dam at night, checking the old mechanisms. My grandfather had built it to last, and though rusty, the gate still turned with the right leverage. I greased the gears, replaced a few bolts, and tested the crank. It worked like a charm, but I wasn't going to act immediately. No, I needed the perfect moment. And it came during the grand opening weekend. The HOA threw a massive event to celebrate the completion of the 79 vacation cabins. They invited investors, city officials, and wealthy buyers. The lake was lit with fireworks, the cabins strung with fairy lights, and music blared across the water. People toasted champagne on their decks, kids splashed in the shallows, and speedboats raced across the waves. I stood on my porch that night watching. They thought they had won. They thought they had taken everything, but they were standing on borrowed water, and I held the key to taking it all back. Gregory Hart was the kind of man you hated on sight. The first time I saw him, he stepped out of a brand new Range Rover wearing a pressed polo shirt with the Silver Pines HOA logo embroidered on the chest. His sunglasses probably cost more than my truck. He had the permanent smirk of a man who believed the world owed him something, and the arrogance of someone who had never been told no. At the first HOA meeting I attended, Gregory singled me out. "Mr. Walker," he said, calling me by my last name like a schoolteacher addressing a truant child, "your cabin is not in compliance with our community guidelines. We'll need you to submit a renovation plan within 30 days. I raised my eyebrow. "Community guidelines? My family was here before this HOA even existed." He leaned back, smiling, his manicured fingers steepled together. "And we respect that history, but progress requires everyone to adapt. Your property lowers the value of this development. We'd be happy to purchase it from you generously." The word generously made the room chuckle. I stared him down. "Not for sale." That's when I realized Gregory didn't just want my property, he wanted me gone. Over the next few weeks, the harassment began. First, it was letters stuffed into my mailbox, fines for leaving my fishing gear out, notices for unauthorized structures on my land, threats of legal action if I didn't comply. Then came strangers trespassing, clipboard-carrying inspectors sent by the HOA to assess safety hazards. One of them had the nerve to measure my dock, like he was planning to bulldoze it. When intimidation didn't work, Gregory went personal. One morning I woke up to find my driveway blocked by a rental golf cart parked sideways. On another, someone had dumped trash bags full of beer bottles at the edge of my property. The HOA even filed a noise complaint with the county because Old Red the rooster crowed before sunrise. Imagine that, the sound of a rooster being illegal on land that had been farmland for 100 years. But Gregory's biggest mistake came one hot afternoon in July. I was out by the water, repairing one of my nets, when Gregory himself strutted down the dock, hands in his pockets, looking like he owned the place. "You're wasting your time." "Walker," he said, kicking at one of the boards like he was testing its worth, "this lake is changing. Families want vacation homes, not rundown shacks. You're standing in the way of progress." I wiped the sweat from my brow and stared at him. "This isn't your lake. You don't know the first thing about it." That smirk again. "That's where you're wrong. I know money when I see it, and this lake is money. So here's the deal. You can either sell to us now, or when property taxes go up after development, you won't be able to afford to stay anyway." I clenched my jaw. The nerve of this man standing on land my grandfather had carved out of wilderness, talking like he owned it. "You want my answer?" I asked. He grinned. "Let me guess, no?" I leaned in. "Not in 1,000 years." Gregory's eyes narrowed. For the first time I saw the smirk falter. He wasn't used to people standing up to him. He muttered something under his breath and stomped back toward his shiny SUV, throwing a final warning over his shoulder. "You'll regret this, Walker. We'll push you out one way or another." That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about harassment anymore. This was war. For weeks after, the tension grew. The cabins filled up with renters and vacationers, loud parties every weekend, fireworks blasting at midnight, jet skis tearing through the lake like they owned it. The water grew murky, fish scattered, and the once pristine shoreline was littered with beer cans and broken glass. Neighbors came to me, frustrated. "Tom," one of them said, "they're killing the lake. Can't you do something?" I wanted to. I really did, but I knew that if I struck back too early, Gregory would twist it in his favor. He had money, lawyers, and political connections. I was just one man with a stubborn streak, but I had something Gregory didn't know about, the dam. Every time I walked past it, I felt its power humming in the background, a silent reminder of who really controlled the lake. The crank wheel was stiff but functional. The water pressure behind the gates was immense. With one decisive turn, I could drain their entire empire. The thought haunted me. At night, I'd sit on my porch listening to the distant thump of music from their cabins and imagine what would happen if the waterline dropped just a few feet. Docks would splinter, boats would be stranded, and those 79 luxury cabins would be nothing but fancy houses next to a mud pit. But I couldn't act yet. I needed Gregory to push me just a little further, so that when I struck, it wouldn't just be revenge, it would be justice. And sure enough, he did. It was the grand opening weekend of Silver Pines Lakeside Resort. They went all out. Banners, catered food, a fireworks display that lit up the entire county. Gregory paraded around with investors, bragging about how the cabins were already booked solid for the summer. He even went so far as to give a speech on the main dock, calling the lake a triumph of modern community living. But then he crossed the line. In the middle of his speech, Gregory gestured toward my cabin. "And soon we'll have the last piece of this puzzle. That old shack will be gone, and the entire lakefront will be unified under Silver Pines. The future is here." The crowd applauded, champagne glasses clinking. I stood on my porch, fists clenched, listening to strangers cheer the destruction of my home. That was the moment I made my decision. Gregory wanted the future. Fine, I'd give him one he'd never forget. My grandfather used to say the dam was the only thing standing between civilized life and a good old-fashioned mess of nature. He built it after the floods in the late 40s, when the county thought the lake was a lost cause and farmers were ready to walk away. He and 3 neighbors hauled rock by hand and poured concrete with sweat and stubbornness. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't engineered by a university. It was perfect for what it had to do. It held back water, leveled the seasons, and fed those fields that stubborn families refused to give up. When he died, he left me the deed and the rusted crank, and a grinning warning that I treat the water kindly, or it might do something rude to anyone who didn't. I never thought I'd use it for anything other than fishing and making sure the weeds didn't take over. But watching the HOA swallow the shoreline, I started to understand that infrastructure isn't neutral. Tools can have owners. Power can have conscience. The dam had both. First, I walked the perimeter. I knew the layout of every bolt and beam the way others know their truck's engine. The gatehouse was small and squat, with a crawl space beneath and a crank wheel on the inside. There was a sluice gate, cast iron heavy as gilt, that rose and fell with a threaded spindle. Over the years, rain and silt had made it stubborn, but nothing unfixable. I spent nights polishing rust off the teeth of the gear, greasing the spindle with motor oil, and fashioning a lever out of an old tractor arm I'd scavenged from a neighbor's scrap. Every creak I soothed felt like a promise. Next, I made allies. The lake hadn't been swallowed without leaving wounded. Old Mrs. Holcomb had been fighting with the HOA for a month after they fined her for planting flowers in front of her porch. Kid Johnson, who'd lost his fishing boat after it was towed for lack of a registered dock, slept in the diner now and told anyone who'd listen about the HOA's guard, a man named Riley, who thought his badge made him a king. Even Randy from the bait shop, who'd sold out half his shipments to luxury cabins, hated what they'd done. They were small people in an enormous mess, but they were also angry, and anger can be organized. We met under the pretense of community preservation, which in truth was code for plotting. Randy brought coffee, Kid Johnson brought bold ideas and a surprising knowledge of municipal bylaws, and Mrs. Holcomb brought a photo album of the lake in its glory days. We talked logistics. We plotted the night of the fireworks show for the grand opening, because that would be when the most people were distracted, and because Gregory would be publicly celebrating the very thing he'd stolen. But it wasn't all bravado. I felt the weight of what I was considering. Draining a lake was not a small prank. It would ruin docks, strand boats, and probably fill the air with lawsuits louder than any fireworks. People could get hurt if I miscalculated. My hand shook when I turned the lever in practice runs. I kept thinking of the line my grandfather used to say about power having conscience. I told the group that we'd be surgical, not spiteful. We wanted to expose greed, not end lives. We'd lower the water enough to make their dream unlivable, not to flood anyone's cabin or hurt anyone. The distinction mattered. We drew plans like storybook criminals in a town that would never believe such a thing could happen there. Kid Johnson measured the average depth and calculated how many feet of drop would leave docks high and dry. Randy mapped out which cabins sat on stilts and which hugged the shoreline so that when water fell, only the HOA's luxury docks would be embarrassed. Mrs. Holcomb remembered a forgotten sluice valve my grandfather had used for irrigation back in the day. It would be our safety failsafe. If things went sideways, we could reopen it partially and avoid catastrophe. There were practical problems. The county had inspectors who might notice tampering. The HOA had security cameras suspiciously placed and a patrol route that liked to take the long way around the marsh. Gregory had a lawyer and pride and enough social capital that he could turn accidents into martyrdom. We had to be discreet, timed, and careful. So we staged rehearsals like a bad community theater. We practiced lifting the lever at night and popping back into the pines so passing cars wouldn't see the silhouette of us against the sky. We camouflaged the crank with a tarp. I bought duct tape like it was contraband. We two-wheeled the lever into position with a pulley on a moonless night. I took pictures not to brag later but to keep technical notes. How many turns loosened the spindle? How long it would take for a 1-inch drop? How the mud would smell when the water receded? All the while I fed Gregory's ego tiny distractions. A note slid under his door about a petty HOA violation. Anonymous, careful, petty. A rumor about zoning inspections circulated in the clubhouse that I made sure a few of his men heard. I gave a local reporter a soft, off-handed quote about the need to preserve historic character, not telling her anything, but getting her to publish an op-ed that seeded the idea of public interest. The plan needed cover stories like birds need nests. The night came quicker than I expected. The grand opening had drawn a crowd that made our little bay look like a postcard. Fairy lights strung from every eave, music thumped from speakers that were too loud for any civil residence. Children ran up and down the shoreline with glow sticks, and champagne flowed like a small, fizzy river. Gregory was on a high podium, paraphrasing success and shaking hands as if the lake were a company and everyone else was stock. I walked to the dam with a sleeping bag rolled over my shoulder like a man going to a campout, because that's what I needed to be, innocuous, patient. My allies were placed like chess pieces. Randy on the bait shop's roof keeping an eye on the patrols. Kid Johnson parked at the far end of the development with a flashlight to signal all clear, and Mrs. Holcomb pretending to be a worried neighbor should anyone question her later. At the dam I set the plan into motion. The gear was stubborn but obedient once coaxed. My hand, guided by memory and the muscle from years of farm work, turned the crank. One full revolution, then another. The sluice groaned and water shivered like a held breath. I counted in my head the turns that equaled inches of descent. We had rehearsed for this. We knew the rhythm. For every 15 turns the water would drop 3 inches. I kept going, slow and steady, thinking of the roosters, the kids, the old men on porches, and the lake itself. There is a peculiar sound when a lake begins to retreat. It's not the splash of emptying. It's the hush of bodies of water, forced to acknowledge gravity. The edges became visible like new teeth. Frogs sang a confused chorus. Somewhere upstream, someone cursed at a boat suddenly resting on its belly. I paused at a prearranged signal. The plan was not to take everything, only enough to make their paradise inconvenient and exposed. Enough mud and stranded boats to make booking cancellations flood their inbox. That, I thought, would be the kind of publicity no luxury marketing campaign could outbid. I glanced up to the clubhouse lights, to Gregory laughing with the investors, to the kids with glow sticks. The lake for a moment felt like a living jury. My hand hovered over the crank, and for the first time since my grandfather taught me how to read the water, I understood what it meant to be a steward, not to hoard power, but to use it when necessary to protect the place you love. I began to turn again. The night swallowed the sound. The water slid away like a secret leaving a room. We were committed. The first hour no one noticed. The party was too loud, the champagne too bubbly, the fireworks too distracting. Gregory strutted across the main dock in his expensive loafers, glass raised high as he bragged about Silver Pines being the crown jewel of lakeside living. His audience clapped and cheered. But out on the far edge of the water, nature was quietly undoing his empire. From the dam, I could feel it before I could see it. The vibrations of the water shifting against the sluice gate ran up through the crank into my arms. The lake's pulse was changing. I kept turning, slow and deliberate, sweat rolling down my temples though the night was cool. After about 45 minutes, I knew it had begun. The shoreline nearest me revealed a strip of slick mud, gleaming like dark glass under the moon. Frogs croaked in confusion, flopping in the shallows where their cover had suddenly disappeared. Randy's flashlight flicked once in the distance, our signal that the patrol had passed without suspecting a thing. Kid Johnson's signal came next, a faint whistle like a night bird from across the ridge. We were in the clear. I turned the crank another notch and sat back, listening. The water was sighing lower, a sound subtle enough that the partygoers hadn't caught on, but loud as thunder to me. Back at the cabins, though, the first signs were beginning. A group of kids splashing near the shore squealed, not from joy but confusion. Their ankles, which had been waist-deep in the shallows earlier, now stood exposed above water. They poked at the mud forming beneath their toes, laughing nervously as parents called them back to shore. A man trying to launch a kayak cursed when it scraped bottom and refused to float. His wife shrugged it off, saying the lake was probably just low this year. But nature doesn't move in slow trickles when a gate is open. It moves with precision. By the second hour, docks began to groan. Those brand-new luxury docks, built with polished cedar and flashy aluminum ladders, stood awkwardly above the water, their pilings sticking out like broken teeth. Boats still tied to them tilted at angles, their engines half buried in the mud. A speedboat revved and sputtered, unable to pull free from the suddenly shallow water. The owner yelled in frustration, while Gregory's partygoers chuckled, assuming it was user error. Then came the fireworks. They lit up the sky with gold and crimson bursts, their reflection shimmering across the shrinking water. The irony was too rich, celebrating a future that was, even as they cheered, draining away beneath their feet. I leaned against the dam wall, arms folded, watching the sky burn with borrowed light. By midnight, panic began to replace laughter. A couple who had rented one of the high-end cabins rushed down to the shoreline, pointing and shouting. Their dock ladder no longer touched water. It dangled in empty space over cracked mud. Another family tried to reel in their pontoon boat, only to find it stuck fast, the hull resting crookedly on exposed rocks. A crowd gathered, murmuring, their voices growing tense. Gregory tried to calm them, of course. He always fancied himself a salesman first and foremost. He raised his voice, assuring everyone that seasonal fluctuations were perfectly normal and that the lake always comes back. But even he couldn't deny the reality when someone shouted, "Look at the waterline." Because the waterline, once a clean sweep across their expensive vacation views, was now a jagged strip of wet, stinking mud stretching as far as the eye could see. The investors, the very people Gregory had tried to impress, began exchanging worried whispers. A woman in a sequined dress wrinkled her nose and muttered about the stench. A man in a suit pulled out his phone, snapping pictures not of the fireworks, but of stranded boats. The laughter died, replaced by arguments and suspicion. Meanwhile, down by my cabin, locals had gathered. Word had spread fast, and they stood on my porch with wide eyes pointing across the water. Old Mrs. Holcomb laughed so hard she nearly cried. Kid Johnson grinned from ear to ear. Randy muttered, "Would you look at that?" Gregory's dream just ran out the back door. I stayed quiet, just watching. I knew better than to gloat too soon. Because Gregory was not the type to bow his head and admit defeat. He was the type to rage, to lash out, to blame. And sure enough, within minutes he was storming across the shoreline, phone in hand, calling anyone who would answer. "Get the county water board on the line. Call maintenance. Someone must have sabotaged this," he shouted. His face was red, his perfect hair sweaty under the harsh glow of floodlights. He pointed at the shrinking lake like he could intimidate nature into reversing itself. But here was the truth he didn't understand. The dam was too far gone to patch. By the time officials arrived, the water level would already be down several more feet. By dawn, their paradise would be nothing but a wet scar of mud and stranded wood. The cabins, the docks, the boats, the entire 79-lot dream, all of it depended on water that was no longer there. As the party dissolved into shouting matches, car engines revving, and angry voices calling lawyers, I slipped back from the dam, my work finished for the night. The crank sat locked in position, the sluice open just wide enough to keep draining steadily until morning. I didn't need to see their reactions when the sun rose. I already knew what they'd find. A lake turned inside out, their dreams cracked and splintered on dry ground. For the first time in months, I felt peace. Not victory, not triumph, peace. Because the lake wasn't theirs anymore. It never had been. And now they finally understood. But Gregory wasn't done. He never was. And the next day he came for me directly. When the sun rose over Silver Pines the next morning, the lake was unrecognizable. What had once been a sparkling jewel was now a patchwork of mudflats and stranded boats, docks hanging uselessly in the air like skeleton arms reaching for water that wasn't there. The smell of algae and fish baked under the morning sun, and the hum of angry voices carried across the shoreline louder than any birdsong. I stood on my porch, sipping black coffee, watching the scene like a man who already knew how the play ended. Car doors slammed as renters packed in a hurry. Trucks with trailers tried to haul boats out of the muck, their tires spinning in ruts. Children cried because the beach their parents had promised them was now a swamp. Investors, the ones Gregory had wooed with speeches and champagne, drove away without so much as a handshake. Gregory, however, was still there. He stood at the center of it all, shouting orders, phone pressed to his ear, his perfect hair disheveled, his khakis caked in mud. He looked less like a president of an HOA and more like a man watching his empire burn down. By noon, he came storming up my dirt road. His Range Rover bounced over potholes, kicking up dust until it screeched to a halt in front of my cabin. He slammed the door so hard it echoed through the trees. His face was crimson, his eyes bloodshot. "You," he shouted, marching up my steps without an invitation. "You think you're clever, don't you? You did this. Don't you dare deny it." I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee slow. "Morning, Gregory. Lake looks a little low today, doesn't it?" He jabbed a finger at me. "You sabotaged the dam. You'll pay for this. I've got the county water board on speed dial. Lawyers ready to drag you through court for the rest of your miserable life." I chuckled. Sabotaged? Funny. Last I checked, the lake fluctuates naturally. Didn't you tell everyone that last night? His jaw tightened. "Don't play games with me, Walker. I know you're behind this. You've been against us since day one. You think draining the lake will stop progress? You're wrong. We'll rebuild. We'll refill. We'll crush you." I set my mug down and leaned forward. "Gregory, let me explain something your money can't buy. This lake doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to your investors, your HOA, or your vacation renters. It belongs to the land and the people who've lived with it long before you ever rolled in with your Range Rover. You thought you could control it. Turns out you can't even control your own dock." For a moment I thought he might swing at me, his fists clenched, his shoulders squared. But instead, he pointed at me with a shaking hand. "This isn't over. I'll make sure you regret this for the rest of your life." He stormed off, tires spitting gravel as he peeled out of my driveway. But I knew Gregory well enough by now. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't the type to lick his wounds quietly. No, he'd come back swinging, and I needed to be ready. That evening, my neighbors came over. Mrs. Holcomb baked a pie for the victory. Kid Johnson slapped me on the back so hard my ribs ached. And Randy just grinned like a fool, saying, Gregory's face looked like he'd swallowed a lemon the size of Texas. We laughed, but I kept my smile tight, because I knew Gregory wasn't done. And sure enough, within days the retaliation began. First came the deputies, knocking on my door with a warrant to inspect my property for safety violations. They walked around with clipboards, snapping pictures, making notes. One muttered something about non-compliant septic systems. Another suggested my dock was structurally unsafe. I didn't need to ask who sent them. It had Gregory's fingerprints all over it. Then came the lawsuit. A thick envelope dropped in my mailbox, full of legal jargon accusing me of environmental sabotage, destruction of property value, and intentional infliction of economic harm. Gregory's lawyers had thrown every word in the dictionary at me, hoping something would stick. My neighbors rallied around me, offering to pitch in for legal fees, but I waved them off. "Don't worry," I said. "Gregory's building his case on mud, and mud doesn't hold." But the real showdown came a week later. It was just past midnight when I heard the sound of engines near the dam. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, making my way through the trees. As I approached, I saw 3 figures with crowbars and bolt cutters trying to force the gate closed. Gregory was among them, barking orders while 2 of his hired goons strained against the crank wheel. "Come on," he hissed. "If we close this, the water will refill. We'll get our lake back." I stepped out of the shadows, rifle in hand. "Evening, gentlemen." They froze. One of the goons dropped his crowbar with a clang. Gregory turned, his face pale in the moonlight. "You've lost your mind, Walker," he spat. "You can't stop progress. This dam is county property. You have no right to—" "Funny," I interrupted, "because I've got the deed in my cabin saying otherwise. My grandfather built this dam. It's mine, legally and historically. And if you try to mess with it again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing and vandalism." Gregory sneered. "You won't shoot me. You're too soft for that." I lowered the rifle slightly but kept my eyes locked on his. "Maybe, but the sheriff will be real interested in seeing the security footage I set up last week." That did it. His smirk faltered. He glanced at the goons, who shifted nervously. After a tense silence, he growled, "This isn't over. Walker." Then he turned and stormed off into the night, his men trailing behind him. I stood by the dam long after they were gone, the rifle heavy in my hands. I'd won the battle, sure, but I knew Gregory wasn't a man who accepted defeat gracefully. He'd try again, one way or another. And when he did, I'd be ready. Because the lake wasn't just water. It was history. It was power. And as long as I held the dam, I held both. The storm had passed, but the town was buzzing like a hornet's nest. Everyone had seen the footage of the cabins collapsing, of the artificial paradise crumbling into soaked timber and shattered dreams. My little act of defiance had spread far beyond the lake. It was on social media, in local news reports, even picked up by national outlets who framed it as a modern-day David versus Goliath story. A lone landowner against a greedy HOA empire. The HOA's board members were furious. They called an emergency meeting in what was left of their headquarters, a gaudy, overbuilt log cabin that had water damage climbing up its walls. Their lawyers swarmed like vultures, throwing around words like restitution, negligence, destruction of property. They wanted me behind bars, but when the county inspectors arrived, things didn't quite go the way the board expected. For months, the HOA had cut corners. They never filed proper permits for the cabins. They ignored environmental impact studies. They violated zoning laws and water rights. The dam and lake, which had existed for over a century, were legally recognized as historic property. My property. Their entire project had been built on fraud, greed, and arrogance. The cabins weren't just destroyed. They were never legal in the first place. When the sheriff's deputy read out the charges, not against me, but against the HOA board, their faces drained of color. Fraud, environmental damage, illegal construction, even tax evasion. The same board that had bullied neighbors, fined families for hanging flower baskets, and forced people to repaint their shutters, now stood shackled in handcuffs, faces plastered on the evening news. But justice didn't end there. The lake had always been a place of peace, a sanctuary for the townsfolk. Families fished from its banks, children skipped stones across its still surface, and old-timers told stories of summer nights spent under the stars. The HOA wanted to turn it into a private resort for outsiders, a money machine for their pockets. When I opened that dam, it wasn't just revenge, it was restoration. Over the weeks that followed, the community rallied together. Volunteers worked side by side with county crews to clear the wreckage. Local carpenters reclaimed the ruined wood from the cabins and used it to build fishing docks, picnic tables, and open shelters. Farmers brought food to feed the workers. For the first time in years, people smiled when they walked by my property. They didn't see me as the grumpy loner with a stubborn streak. They saw me as the man who saved their lake. And then came the lawsuit. Not me suing the HOA, the state suing them. Millions in damages, cleanup costs, environmental restoration fees. The cabins had been their golden goose, their big gamble to finally step out of the shadows of small-town politics and rake in real money. Now, with fines stacking up and jail time looming, the HOA was bankrupt. Their offices closed. Their signs were torn down. The so-called board members were stripped of their power, their reputations ruined forever. One night, a few weeks after it all settled, I sat on my porch with a cold drink in hand. The moonlight shimmered across the lake's surface, calm again, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Fireflies blinked over the tall grass. Somewhere across the water, I could hear the laughter of children splashing. That sound had been missing for too long. As I leaned back in my chair, my phone buzzed with a message from an old neighbor. Someone the HOA had forced to sell their house years ago because their front porch swing didn't match community standards. The message was simple: "You did it. You gave us our home back." And in that moment I realized something. The HOA never cared about community. They cared about control. They tried to own everything: the houses, the yards, the lake, even people's spirits. But they underestimated one thing: you can't own loyalty or love or the will of people who've had enough. The lake was free again. The dam still stood, but this time under my careful watch. No more HOA patrols with clipboards. No more threats, no more fines for leaving a canoe tied to the dock. The people had their freedom, and I had mine. Word spread across nearby counties, and folks began visiting the lake again, drawn by the story of how a stubborn old landowner had toppled an empire with nothing but a lever and a flood. Some called me a hero. Others called me crazy. But every person who sat on those new docks, every child who threw a line into the water, every family that gathered to watch the sunset, agreed on one thing: the HOA's reign was over. And me? I just smiled, leaned back in my chair and listened to the water lapping gently against the shore. Their dreams of 79 luxury vacation cabins had sunk beneath the waves. My dream, a quiet lake, a free community, and a life lived without bullies, had risen in its place. The HOA wanted to own my lake. But in the end, the lake owned them.